Hi. So in the previous session, we talked about how to mock functions using Jest. And in this session, we are going to talk about how to mock modules and some very important variations around it and some popular variations around it basically. And that's where what we discussed in the previous session about mocking functions. It will also come in handy here. I have an actual example here instead of just a dummy example with some hello world thingy. Uh, so I have a project here, and you can see that basically I've got two folders. So one is called service, another one is test. Inside service, I've got a service here called KMS service. So basically, this service is making use of a service from AWS Cloud, and the service name is KMS. And I have a class here called KMS service, and that class is basically your key management service uh, class. So it has got two functions. One is encrypt secret, and another one is decrypt secret. So basically, you can pass it a secret, and you can pass it your master key that is maintained on the cloud, and it will actually give you an encrypted password in the end. And you can use that password to, for example, if you want to store your DB password in your Git repo, but you don't want to store it in a plain password form, then you can store it in encrypted password and have your pipeline or your server talk to KMS and have it decrypted. Which brings me to the next method, which is decrypt secret. So this method basically accepts the encrypted password, the cipher, and it will decrypt it. So the constructor is expecting a client, the KMS client, and the same KMS client has these two methods called encrypt and decrypt, and we pass in the parameters, and these methods I believe have been written before the promise thing was popular, so it still follows the callback format, and this promise method is more like promisification of that method. So basically, on top of encrypt, we have to call the promise so that I can use that in a sync await chain, async await format. Okay, so having said that, I also have another service called KMS service clone. But all that's doing is exporting this KMS service, which I import here, as a default export, whereas KMS service JS was exporting it as um, not a default export, but one of the exportable entities or classes. And I have also another a module called encryptor. And basically, this encryptor is making use of the KMS service within it. And it just got one function that I'm exporting as opposed to a class or something. So this one is exporting a function. KMS service was exporting a class. So I have just some basic use cases that we usually come across, and we will learn some examples around it. Okay. Now just to demo it, so in index.js, what I'm doing is I'm importing the KMS module from AWS SDK, setting the KMS client here, and creating an instance of the KMS service by importing it. And first I'm encrypting the password using my key here, the master key, and I'm just giving it a sample secret that I want to encrypt. And the output would be an encrypted cipher, which I'm feeding it back into the decrypt secret method, which will give me back my actual password. So let me just run through this one time so you understand what it's like. So I'm inside the same folder here, just demo. Okay, and I'm going to run the index.js. And if you see, it's holding there for a while because it's making a network call and it gives me back my password. Now it's not exactly quite visible what's happening underneath, so let me just show something to you. So for example, let me comment out this line here. So this is where I'm getting a buffer, kind of a blob here from my password, and that blob is then converted to base64 string, and then that's our actual password. Okay, so let me just show that to you. And you can see that I can see some buffer output here, right? And you can also see that I'm making a KMS client. I'm making use of an actual network client here. The KMS client will, when I print it, you can see that it's actually making a call to the KMS service on US-2 region. My AWS credentials are already loaded on this terminal, and needless to say, I'm not going to show them to you, but just assume that it's there. Um, so this is the actual use case that we have, and let's see how we can actually demo it, how we can actually create, uh, how we can mock all these modules, and let's see some popular variations around it. So before we go into creating test files for this, let's understand why we need to mock network calls, especially in unit test. So there are a couple of reasons for that, but the ones I can think of right away is because if you if you do your unit testing with actual network calls, that's gonna slow down your testing. And unit test is something that developers run frequently, and you want it to be as fast as possible to give you a quick output. So that's one reason. The second is, for example, the network can be unreliable. Okay, so network could have a lot of glitches, and you could be working from a location where you can't connect to the thing through VPN or something, and you don't want that to hinder your unit testing. Uh, then network could also have another kind of restriction. So for example, you could be hitting an API, and if you do make a lot of network calls, then you could be rate limited, or some of the APIs can even be they charge you per API calls, and you don't want to actually run into huge bills just by making network calls, in unit testing. So yeah, and another one is uh, unit tests actually don't have to do that. So for example, if you know what the output of the network call can be, the different combinations of the outputs of that network call, then you can kind of mock it, and all you want to test is the execution part, the business logic, and how it actually proceeds. And that's why unit tests don't have to use the network calls. Now, what should we be mocking actually in the unit test? So when the execution of a method passes outside of that method into another object, and it comes back again, that's when you have a dependency, and it is the dependency that you have to mock. So for example, if you go back to our KMS service example, and if you look at the method here, encrypt secret, so you see that somewhere in here, this try block, you see that the execution is being delegated to this client. So this is going out of this method, right? It's going to this client, and then client is going to execute it and come back. So this is where you have a dependency, and you should be able to you should be mocking that dependency. And the right way to mock a dependency is actually accept it as an argument. So make sure that you always accept your dependency as an argument as much as possible. It may not be possible all the time, and you could still mock some other dependencies that you don't accept as arguments, but usually the dependencies, if you can accept them as arguments in your uh, class construction or in your method construction, that's an ideal scenario, because then you can send a mock dependency here and execute it, and then give you the output that you want. And that's something we need in unit testing. And I'll talk about that when I start uh, with the testing, with writing the test file. So that this is the dependency, and that's what we have to mock. Now, a unit test should test a single code path or execution path through a single method. So if you look at the method here, so we should be testing all kinds of execution paths here. All right. So clearly, if you can see that there are basically two major execution path here. So there are two different blocks. So you got a try block and a catch block. So when you're executing this method, you could either be in this try block and return, or you could come in this catch block and get thrown. So these two execution paths have to be tested. And then there could be multiple scenarios here based on the errors. You could have multiple sub scenarios here in terms of how you get thrown. But right now there are two typical code execution path here. Each execution path should be unit tested. Okay. Now, when you test the code with the actual network dependency instead of a mock dependency, so that's not unit testing, that is integration testing, and we also have integration testing in a lot of projects. But unit testing does not have to use the actual network dependency. You can mock, or you should mock the dependency. Okay, so yeah, having said that, now let's move on to the testing. Gone ahead and written a simple test case already, and we'll start with that. So in this one, we were trying to mock the module, this KMS service module, all right? And I have written the describe function here, which is the global function that Jest makes available for us to use in the test files. Okay, just like test and expect, it's also a global uh, uh, function that we can use. Test, it, describe. All right, and we will see an example of creating a mock object without making use of Jest, and that mock object would be the mock client here. So we know that we are executing this method, and this method is making a network call here. So this client has this encrypt method which makes a network call. So we will try to create a mock object out of it, and that mock object has to have this encrypt method, and that has to have this promise method as well. So how would we do it without making use of Jest? So if you want to create a mock object here, one way you could do that is by creating an object, okay, and in that object I have this encrypt property which is a method. So I have this arrow function here, and that returns another object. So because I'm writing an inline object that I'm returning, so I have it in round brackets here. Okay, and that object has this promise property which is again a function. Okay, and that one is returning this object, and that object has this ciphertext blob property. Now, because we are expecting ciphertext blob, so that's what we are returning in our mock client. And we are running toString method on top of that blob. Now, this toString is not your normal toString method. This toString is called against a buffer, and it's doing the base64 stringifying the output here. Okay, so that's why I'm passing it the sample password. Okay, and if I run it, I should get back sample password q blah 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 here. Okay, so that's my encrypted password. Okay, so that's how I would create a mock object, and then I'm actually creating the instance of the service, and I'm calling the encrypt secret method here. And because it's an async function, I'm awaiting it here, and because that is await, I have the async here. All right, so I await the output. The output would be the encrypted password, and I expect it to be sample password. Now this client is actually created any without any jest mocking. Okay, so if I run it right now, so for example, if I run it here, the execution succeeds and this particular test gets also asserted, as you can see. But and I think I'll just wait for it to run completely. As you can see, it has run. But there's a limitation here. For example, if I want to check if this encrypt method has been called with such and such parameter, in this case ABCD and 1, 2, 3, 4, there is no easy or clear-cut way to test that, and we might have to dig deeper into the JavaScript and the inner workings of that just to find out. And we'll have to write some complex queries. And that is where frameworks like Jest they come very handy. They give you all the things that you want to test. For example, I also want to check whether how many times this method has been called, and if it accepts some complex object, then that complex object has such and such properties and everything. If it's expecting an array, then the array actually includes at least this many elements and they have this such and such values. So all such validations is useful if you use it, is very handy if you use a test framework. And that's one way to do that. Okay, now we will see another way to do that, where instead of passing the mock client, we can actually just change the mock implementation of the AWS provided KMS service itself. Okay, and we'll see that in this next uh, test case. So I've gone ahead and written the second test case as well. So you can see that here, instead of creating a mock client, what I'm doing is I'm importing the KMS module from AWS, okay, and I'm changing its implementation of the encrypt method entirely, okay. So the way I would do that, because it's a class, so I'm accessing its prototype property and its encrypt method, and I'm actually changing its implementation here. So now this is a function that will return a promise, that will return an object that is a promise method, and that method returns the same kind of output as here. Okay, so this is another way you could mock it. So instead of actually passing a mock client, I'm actually changing the implementation here itself. Okay, of the KMS service itself. So what happens here is I'm actually now making use of the actual KMS service to create the client. But of course, because I've changed the implementation of its encrypt method, it's going to give me the output that I desire. And I should be able to test my execution path and everything. Now, this is still using a non-jest, this is still without using jest, but I just wanted to show you another way how that could be possible. So what I'm doing here is now I'm creating a KMS client using the KMS service, and I'm passing that client to the KMS service, which is different than what we had here. So we were creating a mock client here. Here we are creating an actual client using the KMS service of AWS. It's just that its encrypt method has been mocked this time. And now I again call this method, and it's still going to get me the output that I desire. So uh, if I run test again, it is going to succeed. But again, it has the same limitation that I won't be able to test very complex things like the what is the parameter list that encrypt method received and how many times it has been called and a bunch of other things. Okay, so now we'll see the next example of how you would actually do it using Jest. So let's see the Jest way of doing it in a while. So here's a third test where I'm using Jest to mock the module here. Okay, so what I've done is I'm going with the approach of creating a mock client. Okay, so I have my mock client here, and this mock client is the one that has one encrypt method, and this method has been mocked. And this mock method you can see is has been mocked using Jest. Now we know that encrypt method has another method called promise. So what I have here is just mock implementation method, because basically mock encrypt itself is actually giving you an object, but it's not giving you any output. Okay, so it's not returning any value. It's just an mock implementation, a function that actually just returns you something. That's yeah. So that's why we have the promise property here, and that is again a function. So this mock promise method is the one that when we call, that actually gives us the value. So that's what gives us a promise, and that's why we are calling the mock result value here, because this is going to be an async function, an async mock function that when called gives us a promise that resolves to this value right here. Okay, so it's the same value that we've been using here. Just in case if this is not clear what this output is like, so let me just play this code here in the terminal. So if I go to the node terminal and if I run this output buffer from, and just a minute. So let's say if I execute this in the node terminal, what I get back is a buffer. Okay, and if I call toString method on it with base64, okay, what I get back is this output. So that's what I'm expecting here, because the actual implementation is doing something like this. So I'm trying to mimic it as much as possible. Okay, so having said that, now I'm doing the same thing that I did in the first test here. So I'm creating the KMS service instance by passing this mock client, and then I'm calling the method, and I should be able to do the same assertion that I did before. But not only that, I should be able to now check whether my encrypt method here has been called with the right set of parameters. So that's one check that I'm here doing here. So that is mock encrypt, that is the encrypt method here, whether it has been called with the right set of arguments. Okay, so it is expecting, for example, if you see that the encrypt method here is expecting params, and params has this key ID and plain text in an object. So that's what I'm expecting to be passed to it as parameters. So that's what I'm asserting here. So you can see that this is the way you would write it. Now um, because you have this mock encrypt as a separate function, this is one way you could do it. But another way you could do it, and which is not a very clean way, but you could still do it, is by checking whether encrypt method, which will have now the mock property, and it will have this calls property, and I think we have covered this in the previous session. And this property pretty much should give you the same output as this, and then you should do something like to match object, because when you're matching two objects for the similarity in terms of the keys and the values, you should use match object instead of to be, because that wouldn't work, because of you'll have some serialization issues because each object is different, and you just want to make sure that the values and keys are different, so you use the to match method. But the main point is that this two will pretty much get you the same output that you want. Okay, except that this the second approach is a bit noisy. Okay, and it looks more encrypted instead of this, because this reads very human friendly. So you could do both ways basically. So instead of writing mock encrypt here, you can just copy paste the whole implementation here. Okay, and replace this mock encrypt method entirely. But that is still fine, and then you would have to do something like this. But I prefer this approach because it's more clean. Okay, and similarly, you have this mock encrypt to have been called times as well. There are times when you are calling the same method multiple times because you are in a loop, or you have multiple calls and multiple checks, and that's where this assertion comes handy. Okay, so I'm going to again run npm run test, and this time it should succeed as well. So having said that, now that we have covered some happy scenarios, now we can move on to doing some unhappy scenarios. Okay, so Uh, just to again reiterate that using Jest, we can also do something similar where the encrypt method will have the Jest FN mock implementation here. But the cleaner approach is by mocking the dependencies instead of mocking the actual method of your third-party module. So even though this is possible, it should be avoided, and not that it's gonna cause any issues, but it's not a very clean approach. So this is to be done when you're not able to inject the dependency, and you may not be able to inject dependencies all the time, but that is still fine. Okay, but the correct way when you have dependency injection in place, then the correct way should be mocking the dependency and then passing the mock objects to your actual service. Okay, so having said that, now we will see the unhappy scenarios where these methods will throw errors and we will assert them. So in the unhappy scenario here, we are trying to create a mock client when when called will actually return an error instead of returning a value. Okay, so similar to the previous approach that we saw here, we are going to kind of just copy the same that, but instead of resolving a value, we are going to send a rejected value. Okay, so I have the same implementation, pretty much the same. So I have this mock client, that is the encrypt method. The encrypt method is mocked using Jest. It has this promise object, a promise property, which is a method, and this is a mocked method from Jest, and it gives you the rejected value. Okay, and says that something bad has happened. Okay, now I'm going to create an instance of the service, and I'm going to uh, check whether it returns an error. Now there are two approaches of actually testing it, and let's see both of them. So one way you would do that, and I actually prefer that way, is you put it in a try catch block, of course. So I'm just awaiting the KMS encrypt call here, and I know that it's going to throw an error. So I'll catch the error here, and I'm expecting its message to be something bad happened. Now this is, even though it's a bit verbose way, but I prefer it because it's very, it's just the syntax looks very similar and familiar, right? And the just way of doing it is where you call the expect directly, and inside that you have, instead of the uh, instead of what we usually have, for example, the value, you actually put in an async function here. So you put another function inside expect, and that function will then call the KMS encrypt. Now, because we know that this is going to throw an error, we need to wrap it, we need to catch it outside, and that's why we have this internal function here. And so that the expect will then actually catch the error. So that's pretty much the logic. So what we do here, that inside this function we call await, and we are expecting that to reject, so we call dot rejects, and then we call to throw on it, and it should throw the message. Now, even though this is very simple statement, but it's a just specific way of doing it, and even though I know it, I still prefer this because if I can do this, then it is one less thing to learn from Jest. Okay, so but anyway, it's a personal preference. You can choose any of these methods, and it doesn't take much getting used to with this particular syntax here. So these are the two ways you could do that. And just like I explained, so you should actually wrap this await call in a function, and you should just not call it directly here. Although we did that when we had a happy scenario, for example, like this, when we have an unhappy scenario, this will not work because this one is actually throwing an error, it's not returning something, and the expect won't be able to catch it. So let me run this output once. Let me run the test case once with just this, and I'll uncomment these lines and show you what error you might get so that you're just aware to avoid those mistakes. So let me do this and let me run it again, and this time it will throw, and it says yeah, so it says that it couldn't catch it because it was throwing an error, right? So basically when you do this kind of implementation, it doesn't give you any helpful data, and then you scratch your head around thinking that what is it that you're doing wrong. And that's why this scenario, you should either do it this way or this way, but this way is not the correct way. uh, for some people this might not be that intuitive, so I just thought that I'll just explain it here. All right, so this test case, this unit test that we've written, it is specifically meant for KMS service. Okay, and what we are doing basically is mocking the AWS specific behavior. And we did that in two ways. So by sending a mock client, or another way that we learned was by mocking the actual KMS method. So KMS is a class, and we try to also mock its encrypt method, right? So there are two ways to do that, and especially this class was written in a way where we were able to inject the dependency, and this is called dependency injection. I My dependency was not created somewhere in here, it was injected into it, and this was constructor injection instead of method injection. Okay, but the dependency can also be injected through method as an argument, and that's still fine as long as uh, we have a way to inject it. We can inject a mock client and execute a unit test, but that's not always possible, and for a couple of reasons, for many reasons in fact. And that's why I have a class, I have a module here called encrypted.js. Just think of it as something that uses another module, okay, and it is not possible to actually inject the dependency of that particular module. So in this case, this do encrypt method is actually creating an encrypted password of something, okay? And what I'm doing here is I'm creating the KMS client here, right here, okay? And this is being created out of the actual AWS, um, you know, SDK module. And then I'm also using my KMS service here, and I'm passing it the actual KMS client here, okay? So I'm not accepting it as an argument, I'm creating it here, and so there's no way I can inject a mock client here because it's not accepting any arguments. And there could be very many scenarios like this in the wild, because it's not always possible to mock every kind of dependency. Okay, so how do we still test a function like this? Okay, so in this case, for example, this function is making use of the mykms service, and it's returning a custom object. So it's like db password, and that it gives the encrypted db password. Okay, so I'll show you an example of that. So I'm just calling this do encrypt method, and I'm getting the result, and I'm just printing it right now. So let me quickly do that, and I just executed it a minute ago. So this is what the output actually looks like. Okay, so now I want to mock this function. I want to unit test this function, and this function has dependencies with my KMS service, okay, as well as the KMS client. So I need to do right set of mocking here so that I get I can test my output basically. Now there are no execution path here, but my intention here is to show how you can mock a module that is not being injected as a dependency into a function or a class. Okay, and how you can actually go about doing that. Okay, so let me comment this line out again. All right, and let me clear the output here as well. And what we'll do, we have this, I've gone ahead and created this unit test, encrypted test.js. Okay, and here I'm actually importing KMS service and do encrypt method of the encryptor. And this is the one that I'm going to call. And now I actually have to mock my KMS service. Okay, so how do I do it? Well, uh, there's this method called jest.mock, and using that you can actually mock the entire module itself. Okay, so in this case, this module is returning a class, right? This module has is exporting KMS service as one of the exportable entities. It could have more than that. But now if I actually mock this whole module, then it actually creates mock implementation of KMS service as well. Okay, and I'll show you an example of that. So I have this describe block here where I have a test case for using the mocked module here. Okay, so let's see. So what I'm doing here is I'm calling the do encrypt method. Okay, I'm not passing it anything because it doesn't accept any arguments, but I'm creating the mock implementation of KMS service. So KMS service mock implementation, and what it returns is an object. That object has a property called encrypt secret, which is a method, and it is mock encrypt secret. Okay, which is again a jest function that just is an async function. When called, it returns a promise which resolves to this password. Okay, this encrypted password. Okay, now why was I able to call mock implementation on this method? And the reason is I'm mocking the module here. All right, and that's why this should be possible. All right, so let me give you a simple example of that. But before that, let me just run this. Let me just run this module once. Okay, let me run this test case once, and then I'll show it to you. Let me go through the assertions that we are doing here. So what I'm expecting is an object, right? So I'm expecting an object that should have this value, simple password Q, right? So that's one assertion that I can make, and I am also checking whether this encrypt secret method. Now this is the same method as this, so I have this encrypt secret method, right? So that's what I'm doing here. That KMS service, I'm returning an object that has encrypt secret as a method, uh, and its value is a mock function. And I'm checking if it's been called with the right set of arguments and the number of times it's been called. Okay, so I'm going to run npm run test, but when I do that, it's actually going to execute this test case as well, and that's gonna be just a noisy output. And besides, you don't want to, when you're working on one particular unit test and you just want to look at the output of that particular unit test, the way you would do it is actually like this. So because you already have just uh, installed as a dependency, right? So it should be available in the node modules. Okay, and there's under node modules there's jest, inside that there's bin, okay, and inside that there's JestJS, okay, and I'll give it the path of test services KMS and encrypted test.js, okay, and I'm going to run it now, but I have one more test case here, and I just want to show you the output of only this one. So the way I could do it is either I could do test it only, and in that case it will just out of the whole test module, it will just execute this test case only. So this also suits the requirement sometimes, but sometimes you want to execute a set of them So in that case, if you don't want to execute this, then you could also do skip. Okay. Now what you want to do depends on your requirement, and that is fine. This is just when you're doing the development. Okay, eventually you don't want to use skip or only at all in your actual test case when you're once you are finished with them, because you want to have all the test case, all the unit tests running. But just so that you want to test it now, I would both of them are equal. uh, but if you have a lot of test case, then skipping all of them one by one is more time consuming. So you might want to just do it dot only, and it will just execute this one particular test case. So when I do that, it's just gonna execute this one. Okay, so it is only executing encrypted test.js, as you can see here. Okay, and it's going to just execute one test case. Okay, it the execution succeeded, all my assertion was passed, and you can also see that it skipped the other one because I had it dot only on this unit test only, right? And you can see the output of the console log. So you can see that KMS service is now is like it is a mock object itself. And that is why I know that I can call mock implementation once, and all these methods on it. And that's why I was able to call this method here, and I set it to return an object that has this encrypt secret method. And that's pretty much my implementation of the KMS service, right? So I'm going to remove this line here. Okay, I'm also going to remove this. And now let's see if it has to throw an error. How would that look? And I think it should be pretty clear now. So what I'm doing is the same implementation, but instead of setting it to a mock function that would send a resolved value, I'm sending it a rejected value, and I'm just asserting with an await call that I'm wrapping inside an async function within expect, and asserting that its message is the same as what I said here. Okay, so this is how you would mock a module that is being used within a function and that you're not able to inject into the method. Okay, so that is the way you would do it. Now, in this particular case, I'm using a KMS service, which is this, and this one is using it is exporting KMS service as not a default export but as one of the exportable entities. And so let's see an example of how one could use a service that has a default export. Okay, so in this case, KMS service clone is just exporting KMS service, and that is only export. That is the default export. Okay, it's not exporting anything else. Now, this could also become consuming, but there's sorry, this could also become confusing, and that's why I just thought that I would go ahead and create an example of that. Basically, there's not much to be done, but just so that you understand, let's create a separate test module for this and do an implementation of that as well. Okay.